able to join us today. My name is David Gray. On behalf of New America, I'd like to welcome you to this discussion of the new book, Against Us, The New Face of America's Enemies in the Muslim World. It's a pleasure to welcome the author and good friend Jim Scuitto to New America. Jim is as many of you know, senior foreign correspondent for ABC News, and through television, a frequent dinner companion of American families all across the nation on ABC World News Tonight. I find Jim's reporting insightful, and I found this book to be very much as well. As we approach the anniversary of September 11, 2001 this week, there is, of course, continued focus in our nation on our national dialogue about how we interact with countries across the world in our relationship as a nation between people in predominantly Muslim countries. And through his travels throughout the Muslim world, Jim has gotten a unique insight into the views and attitudes of people towards our nation. In his book, if you've read it, and I encourage you to, there are books outside for sale as well as some refreshments, Jim profiles people in 8 different countries to get some experience and insights into how America is viewed, and potentially, more importantly, what can we do to keep our nation's relationships as strong as they can be. We're very pleased that Jim's first public event since the publication of his book will be this event today. And we're first going to hear from Jim talk a little bit about his experience, his travels, and some of his conclusions. And then take your questions, because I know there's some opportunity through questions for things to come out and to hear about some of your thoughts as we approach September 11th. So, with no further ado, Jim Scuitto.
Thank you, David, and thanks for coming. I'm really just thankful for your interest in the book. It's a sort of a labor of love from this experience of these last 6-7 years traveling in this part of the world for ABC. And thanks to David for arranging. My old college freshman year roommate, so it's good to see we're still getting along. I want to tell you a story about someone I met last month in Afghanistan. This is someone who's not in the book, but it just reinforced the impression that I'm trying to get across through the other profiles. I went to Kabul for Barack Obama's visit, and before I left, some contacts in Afghan intelligence asked me if I wanted to meet a captured Pakistani suicide bomber, a failed suicide bomber, obviously. So I took the chance. He was captured with an explosive vest on outside a U.S. military post in Khost, Afghanistan, right along the Afghan-Pakistani border. So we went into the cell to meet him face to face. 90% of the bombers who come across the border are Pakistani. It's the madrasas there are essentially breeding grounds, recruiting grounds as well. A lot of them are young kids who come up as students in the madrasas. He was he's about 30 years old. He didn't know his age, as a lot of people there don't know. So he volunteered, and he told me that he had an imam who was also a friend of his who just encouraged him that this is the best way to use his life. He'd gone to him and said, I don't have a job, I don't have a future, and he said, well, here's your way to make a difference, effectively. The mistake he made is that when he got close to the U.S. base, he stopped to have a drink, and he paid with Pakistani money, and the shopkeeper thought it was strange that he was paying with Pakistani money, and then could tell that he had something underneath his shalwar kameez, and then called some police over, and the police arrested him. And can you guess what drink he bought before he was going to blow up the U.S. base? It was a Pepsi. It was a Pepsi. So there's always more than meets the eye with these guys. So I sat across from him in the prison cell, and it's these are the prisons, but they're very stark. I mean, there's not a lot of security. There are guys around. He was handcuffed, but it was just 2 chairs like this, and the 2 of us and my cameraman. And it was a scary experience because clearly he had the capability to kill. He was not a poser, and I was imagining throughout the interview what he could do to me there. Still, being handcuffed, could he jump me? Could he? And looking in his face, you can tell he was a guy who was able to do this. It was just sort of he was a tough guy. He'd had a tough life, and I could see it in his eyes, in effect. But then, as he started to give me his reasons for why he did this, and they're very familiar. Foreign occupiers in Muslim land, American invaders in Muslim land. They're assaulting my religion. I felt personally insulted. I felt that it was a threat to me, and that this was my duty to go there. That Americans do just as bad things as I was planning to do. They kill a lot of civilians. Just that week, there'd been an American bombing there where Afghan civilians had been alleged to have been killed, 90 of them, and the U.S. is now reinvestigating that attack to see if that actually happened. His manifesto is what you hear not just from jihadis, but you hear it from a remarkable variety of people. The next week, I was back in London, and I was meeting with a guy out in East London who's one of the characters I profile in the UK chapter of the book. He's a former jihadi, a British-born Pakistani, British-born Muslim who volunteered to go fight in Afghanistan after the U.S. invasion. Got there and then realized that the Taliban weren't the nicest guys in the world. They weren't what they imagined. He said, they're just as bad as the Americans. I'm going to go home. He turned himself into an anti-jihadi campaigner. He's kind of like a reformed gang member, a guy who left the gang, Tukey Williams style, and comes back and tries to keep kids from following in his footsteps. And he's doing some real good work there with the support of the British government, even the U.S. government. So I went to visit him, and I was talking to some of his kids in his boys' club, effectively, and their language and their argument and their sentiment was a near exact replica of what the Pakistani suicide bomber had said to me, right down to the buzzwords and the phraseology. Foreign occupier in Muslim land, American hypocrisy. It was as if they were reading off the same talking points. And it's that revelation, which wasn't the first time I'd heard it, but it just reminded me the reason I wrote this book. Because in these, I've been traveling in the Middle East for ABC for most of the 7 years since 9/11. And when you first arrive out there, you expect to hear that sort of hostility from certain kinds of people. I've met a lot of captured al-Qaeda guys, a lot of jihadis. You know what you're going to get. But when I started to hear the same thinking, right down to the same rhetoric from average people on the street, then I started to get worried. And then in more recent years, when I started to hear that from people, not just people that we would expect not to virulently hate us, but people who we would expect to be our allies, our friends in that part of the world, then I knew we had a problem. And it's a collection of things that leads to this thinking. One of them, the most obvious, foreign occupiers in Muslim land, the Iraq War and the Afghanistan invasion are the biggest driving force from their perspective. But then it follows on, and it's seen as part of a consistent policy when you look at, for instance, U.S. support for Israel during the 2006 war. From their perspective, it is that we have it in for Islam, and this is part of U.S. policy, and that 9/11 was the excuse for doing this. But in reality, you want to keep us down. You want to punish us. There's a lot of humiliation involved. So that's sort of point one of that anti-American manifesto. The second one is that U.S. interests override U.S. principle, hypocrisy, repeated constantly. We might have forgotten about Guantanamo or Abu Ghraib. It's faded in our minds. It's certainly faded in how much time it occupies in the evening newscasts or how many column inches in the newspapers. It's not forgotten in that part of the world. It's a major black mark on American record, and that leads to this conviction that America is hypocritical. And then the third part of this thinking, and I think in some ways is at least equally worrying, or maybe even most more worrying, is that the U.S. stands in the way of progress in that part of the world rather than promoting it. And it's that point that I hear from that third category of people, these people who we would think would be our friends. Democracy activists in a place like Egypt, for instance. The Egypt chapter of the book, I profile a woman named Gamila Ismail. She's the wife of Ayman Noor. You might remember he ran against Hosni Mubarak in presidential elections in Egypt in 2005, encouraged by the U.S., backed by the U.S. This was what some at the time in the region were calling the Arab Spring. Start of the year, elections in Iraq, it was a success. People didn't expect that success, and there was a lot of a sense of a pleasant surprise, really, with the way the Iraqi elections went. Then you had small municipal elections in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and later in the year you had elections in Egypt. So Ayman Noor challenges Mubarak. He's not going to win, but at least he's going to give a go at it. He lost, but he got about 10% of the vote. Not bad. The election was certainly rigged, but at least it was a showing. Right after the election, he was thrown in prison. on what everybody there knew to be a false charge, that he had faked petition signatures for his nomination. And 3 years later, he's still in prison. Gamila Ismail, his wife, who used to be a news anchor out there and lost her job after her husband ran for president. No one will hire her now, so she's paying a price as well. Became sort of a full-time crusader for his release. And visiting her in Cairo, she described her frustration that she felt that she had America's backing for this. In fact, she did. She had bold public statements from President Bush, from Condoleezza Rice, who visited at the time of the elections. We will back you. This is a sign that Egypt is changing. And then her husband's thrown in jail, and she said that support went quiet. The public support went quiet, and the sort of backroom support she felt. There was no arm twisting to get this guy out of prison, this guy that the U.S., that Washington had encouraged to run. So today, not only is she angry at America, but she looks at America as someone who's more of an obstacle to progress there than a facilitator of progress. And I didn't just hear it from her. Later in the Egypt chapter, I talked to a blogger there, a guy named Wael Abbas, a 30-something blogger. Egypt has a very active blogging community, to its credit, and that's kind of the unofficial opposition, because the official opposition, the papers, tend to be run by the government, the television stations as well. So at least on the internet, there's still an independent voice. And so here's the next generation, and he says, I don't want anything to do with America in terms of pushing for progress here, because he says we're better off without you. He says if it was just us fighting Mubarak, we'd have better luck than fighting Mubarak and Washington, and that's the way they feel. When you've lost that generation, when you've lost a liberal-minded generation in a country that's an American friend, an American ally in the region, we have a problem. And it's not just about a feel-good factor, it's about advancing U.S. interests, because it is a stated U.S. interest of pushing democratic reform in that part of the world, and not just by something like the Iraq invasion, but by supporting groups like this in Egypt. The Iran chapter talks to an Iranian dissident, similar to Ayman Noor, in that he's also spent a lot of time in prison for standing up to Ahmadinejad. I don't know if you remember this, in 2006 there was a protest that got a fair amount of coverage. Ahmadinejad came to speak at this student's university. His name's Babak Zemanian. And he and several students got up on the back row of seats, jumped up, shouted "Death to the dictator," and burned his photo in public. This is a dangerous thing to do in Iran. And I was there at the time and covered that, and I met him, interviewed him the next day, and he shows up in the interview walking on crutches because he'd been beaten up by government. They're thugs, really. It's kind of a militia called the Basiji. They go around on motorcycles during student protests, and they have one guy on the back with a baton who's breaks kneecaps and that sort of thing. I mean, it's like something right out of The Sopranos. So he had gotten his Basiji attack the next day for organizing this protest, and later he would serve prison time. And recently this year he was sentenced to another term in prison. And he again is someone you need in that country. It's a place where when you go to Tehran, it's actually a very American-friendly place. In that part of the world, Iranians are more likely to say they like America, certainly, than you'll hear in Gulf countries or even Jordan, or even Egypt, in fact, other American allies. Iranians tend to be more cosmopolitan. You can get a false impression if you spend too much time in Tehran, because it's obviously different in the countryside, but still, we have some advantages there. But here you have a young guy pushing for democracy, risking his life for it. But he says that his cause is hurt, not by American hypocrisy in his case, but he says just by talk of war all the time. From his view, that strengthens the hardliners. So it makes it harder for him to stand up to them. And he also says that, I talked to him again when the NIE came out, when we revised the NIE last year, about whether Iran was pursuing nuclear weapons. And he was telling me his head was spinning. He's like, one day, you're about to attack us, and now there never was a reason for it. He said that sort of confusion, you don't really know what America is trying to do here. And that, so it's another reason that he wants to keep us at arm's length. And so those are two examples of that that category of folks who you'd expect them to want our help, to be begging for our help, and to feel stronger as a result of American help. But I don't hear that today. Hopeful things. There's a contradiction at the root of much of this resentment, because there is great admiration as well as great desire in that part of the world for an American lifestyle. That we're talking about music and popular culture and certainly wealth, but also for an American system. If you look at polling in the region, people consistently rank an accountable system of government very high, above religion. Their priorities look very similar to what you would see at a Republican or Democratic convention here: family, job, and a government that works. It's ripped right out of speeches that we've been hearing these last couple of weeks. So they have admiration for that, and they have desire for it. So that admiration creates some resentment. I mean, it's always true that the rich, wealthy country is going to, no one's going to really love us because we have what they don't want, right? So there's a little bit of that in there. But what I think is the bigger driving force is this sense of disappointment that we're not helping them get what they want. And we're not helping them get what we say that we want them to have. They see us as hypocritical, as I mentioned before, places like Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, but also that we hold interests over principle. Now, there's never been a country in the world whose foreign policy doesn't hold interests over principle most of the time, but the trouble is, or a lot of the time, but the trouble is when principle is the central element of the American sales pitch to that part of the world, if you cut corners on principle, you're going to pay a price. And I think in these years since 9/11, we underestimated the price of cutting corners on principle. And that's what I hear constantly from folks in this part of the world. Now, that contradiction, though, provides something of an opening, because what it says to you is that, and I hear this from several of the folks I profile in the book, that they still look to the U.S. for moral leadership. The fact that they're saying that we're not providing it means that they're looking for us to provide it, and to deliver change. There is hope that America has influence there. They just feel, in their view, that we're not using that influence to accomplish what we say we want to accomplish and what they want, and that what they want, the way they want their lives to change. Solutions. What's the way forward in this part of the world? The book's not meant to be prescriptive, because I don't imagine that I have a 12-step plan for solving the problems. But there's certainly templates for the way forward. And one is sticking to principle. It makes a difference in a place like Egypt. If you back a guy like Ayman Noor, you'd have to expect that we have the influence to get him out of prison, and that would be tremendously powerful in that part of the world. Just the way that a place like Guantanamo has been negatively powerful in terms of influence, the way America is perceived there. Sticking to principle actually does make a difference, and you have to deliver on it. Engagement. The challenge we have of engaging the people who would be our allies in those places is real, partly because of their perception that we're hurting them rather than helping them. So you have to have those friends. You have to develop those relationships with a guy like Babak in Iran, and with someone like Gamila Ismail and Ayman Noor. If you've abandoned them to the government, then you've lost an ally on the ground. And I think as well, delivering on promises. We're held to a higher standard, partly because we hold ourselves to a higher standard. That, of course, makes it always more difficult to reach that standard because it is so high. But if you make promises and you don't deliver on them, you're certainly going to pay a price as well. And I think Afghanistan is the best example of that. The girl that I profile there is young. She's 18 years old. She's just beginning college. I met her at a school 2 years ago outside of Kabul, and she sort of ran up eager to meet an American and spoke English better than anyone there, and was very forthright for a 16-year-old, as she was at the time. So we ended up keeping up a friendship. While we were there, we were doing interviews, but we email all the time, and she, like many Afghans, still gives America the benefit of the doubt. Afghanistan is the one place where the majority of people say nice things about America. The trouble is that percentage is declining. After the invasion 7 years ago, it was 80, 85%. Now it's down into the 50s. And the reason for that is because no one, including this girl Homa in Afghanistan, expected 7 years after the U.S. invasion that Afghanistan would look like it does today, which is to say, still a very dangerous place with very patchy development. Kabul is unrecognizable. There were bicycles, and now there are shiny white new Toyotas. But when you get farther out of the capital, things haven't moved forward at all. This June, I went out with the U.S. Marines in Helmand province in the south, and they were part of the Afghan surge, called the Afghan surge earlier this year. When they arrived in southern Helmand province in April of this year, there had not been a single coalition soldier there in the 7 years since the U.S. invasion. This is the hotbed of the Taliban, always has been, and particularly now because many of them fled in that direction. It's also, by itself, Helmand province, the biggest drug-producing state, country in the world. It's where all the opium is grown. And there were no U.S. or coalition forces in that part of Helmand until April of 2008. So nearly 7 years after the invasion. And that's what's provided the opportunity, as you've seen, as these attacks get closer and closer to the capital as well. I just want to talk about one of those attacks because it goes back to where I started, this suicide bomber that I met. The threat of suicide bombers in Afghanistan is not theoretical, it's very real. It's out there. We were staying in the Serena Hotel in Kabul, which is the nicest hotel in Kabul. It'd be a five-star hotel really in any city. And we were all relieved, reporters who go to Afghanistan regularly, when they opened this place up, because you finally had a decent place to stay. You would come out of the field, you'd come out of Helmand province covered in dust, and you could go there, and you had great showers, and you had a gym and a spa. I mean, it was just unbelievable. It didn't fit the scene. In January of this year, I'm sure you might have read about it, Taliban insurgents attacked the Serena Hotel. 3 suicide bombers. And when we were there on this last trip, Afghan intelligence, they were for the first time telling me the details of how the attack was carried out. 3 suicide bombers. The first one at the front gate blows himself up, and he had a directional, his vest was designed to be directional, so it exploded forward, killed the guards, but not his 2 friends behind him. The 2 then go through the gate. The second guy throws a few grenades, shoots a few more guards and a few hotel guests, blows himself up there. The third one goes inside the lobby, kills a number of journalists, a number of hotel staff, a few foreign diplomats who were there as well. And it turns out he had stayed in the hotel 2 months before as a guest to case the place. So he knew that at this hour of the day, it was a Friday, it was about 5 o'clock, that all the foreigners would be in the gym. So he walks through the spa into the gym, and he killed most of the people on the treadmills there, in the steam rooms, that kind of thing. When he does that, he decides, in effect, he's killed enough people, and he takes his suicide vest off. And they were wearing police uniforms, takes that off as well. This kind of gets into more casual civilian clothing. And then he tries to mix in with the rest of the hotel guests who are now being gathered in the lobby area with police all around them, and just acts like he was a victim, not like he was the attacker. He's thinking, I've done my job, I can get out of here. And he actually places a call, he had a cell phone, he places a call to the head of the cell who designed this and said, what do you think I should do? You know, I've killed a lot of people, the other 2 guys are dead. Is it okay with you if I get out of here? And the guy says, sure, you've done your job. The Afghan police was smart in that they kept everybody inside the hotel. And they started looking at the CCTV footage. And then they see that the 3rd bomber took his vest off and went in the crowd. So they went to the crowd and picked him out and put him in jail, and where he's now. I didn't get to meet him, but he's now sitting in that same jail. So like our friend who stopped for a Pepsi before blowing up the U.S. post, the U.S. military post, there's more to these guys than meets the eye. And that's another point. What I wanted to do in this book was focus on, I hate to use the word normal, but normal people on the street. You can fill a book with 1,000 jihadis. But what I wanted to show was that what you hear from jihadis, you now hear from people you wouldn't expect to hear it from. And that's a problem. It's a threat for U.S. interests there. But even the jihadis that you meet, one caricature that I wanted to break is that these are somehow robotic nut jobs. You know, the people who volunteer for this sort of thing, for instance, the guy in the first chapter of the book, a guy named Yildar, a 21-year-old marketing major from a university in Jordan, who, when the U.S. invaded Iraq, talked with his friends and said, "This is American soldiers on Muslim land. It's my duty to go fight." Again, that same sense and that same drive, drops everything and goes in. Could very well have been killed. He didn't. He's lucky. He went back to school. He served an 18-month prison sentence and is now back with his family in Jordan. So they can be normal people too, you know, and driven to things that you wouldn't expect. And that's really what I'm trying to do here. One, show that this kind of thinking pervades a remarkable variety of people today, and I think an increasing variety of people, but also that even the ones who are the most severe cases, the hardest cases, you know, they're real people too, not to excuse what they're doing by any means, but it shows what we have to address if the way they view us is driving this kind of person to do this sort of thing today. So I wanted to leave it at that now to give you a chance to ask some questions, because I could talk for hours, but I hope I at least gave you some grist for the mill.
This guy's a professional, so he doesn't need me moderating the questions here, but I will take prerogative to ask the first two. I think about you when you first went over to the Middle East. I remember you had one article about going jogging in Kabul, and I think about the region and how it may have changed since you started your work as a correspondent. And I think not as much about Afghanistan actually, but specifically around the nations that are more impacted by oil. And as we all see record oil prices, I'm wondering how the region as a whole may have changed, whether the oil price, not just countries like places like Dubai, where you have great growth, and you're focused on the level. It may be that the oil is keeping regimes in place longer than they might otherwise be. But how have you, in your travels, seen oil impact any of the work that you've done? And then secondly, I wanted to ask around the view that the folks may have of Muslims in America. And so we have an increase in the population. You have Keith Ellison, you have the first Muslim representative. You've got a presidential candidate who has the big debate about whether or not Obama is and how might someone in some of these countries view America in terms of Muslims there's this stereotype around. I'm not saying Obama, but it's very interesting, this sort of blogging piece making a statement around him. And so if folks look at Obama saying, "No, I'm not Muslim," as if that were a problem, what does that say in terms of our image? And I find it a very interesting thing about how that whole debate plays out and would be viewed in some of these countries.
Okay, on oil first. I was in Dubai on my way in and out of Afghanistan on this trip, and I hadn't been in Dubai for 2 years. And the change in that time, it was like Las Vegas doubling in size in 2 years. Unbelievable construction. The city extending out. I can't imagine how they're going to fill all these buildings, but I'm sure you've seen it's going to be the tallest tower in the world, and you started with the Palm Islands, and now you have the world. They're making islands off the coast there, so you can buy, say, New Zealand if you want to, a little tiny island version of New Zealand to build your house on. But the level of money in a place like that, it's literally incredible, and you see it visually. And when I was there on that trip, I was thinking Americans have to come see this, because just to get a sense of how much money is floating around here, and how quickly that can transform a country physically. When we're talking about minor improvements in the States by comparison, fixing bridges after the bridge collapse, for instance. I mean, they're building an entire city in a 2-year span, and when I go back in 2 years, I'm sure it'll be double the size again. And what that, beyond just the physical representations of that, you also see that reflected in people's confidence, that people feel the power of that money, kind of renewed pride, a sense that it's their turn now to be wealthy. You've had a monopoly on it for so long. Now here's our chance. It reminds me of what I hear when I go to Russia. That feeds into this sense of you've kept us down, and now we're back up, and you better watch out. And it's you get a lot of sort of it's like beer muscles in oil form. So that's about oil. About the way Muslims are treated here. I think that most people in that region don't think we have many Muslims in the States. They don't really have an impression that we have that many. it's interesting. When I talk about British Muslims in that chapter, I compare the situation with Muslims in Britain with Muslims in the U.S. because there's a lot of talk and analysis in the UK. Why do young British-born Pakistani teachers become more religious than their parents and get drawn into this kind of, into jihad? They perfectly good upbringings and fairly privileged lifestyles. Why do they do it? One of the theories is that Muslim communities there are much more insular. And it's a two-way street, partly because many of the Pakistanis who came over in the 50s and 60s to work in factories didn't speak English. They weren't encouraged to speak English or required to when they came, so their communities were sort of self-sustaining. And therefore, there wasn't a lot of mixing back and forth or interaction. And also the reaction from many British communities was very standoffish. So it worked from both directions. And when you have communities like that, it makes it easier to so they say, for this kind of thing to develop. And when you compare that to the situation with large American Muslim communities here, say in the Detroit area, I mean, one advantage they had is they tended to be more educated and wealthier, the ones who, large numbers of majorities of the ones who came here, so that by its nature meant more interaction. But also just the way the U.S. melting pot works, they were more likely to get assimilated. Well, not assimilated, but integrated. So it makes it less likely. But it's interesting. I talked to a couple folks both in the U.S. and Europe to say, wait a second, are we missing something here? Are we too comfortable in the way Muslim communities are integrated in the States? And one of them mentioned a guy like Ellison, for instance. They said that the tipping point, or if not quite the tipping point, the turning point is not that difficult to find. That Muslim communities in the States are certainly very conscious of the way a guy like Ellison is treated, and if they see that there's a hostility here, or the way there's talk of Obama's supposed Muslim faith, that you can easily create that kind of hostility. Not to say that all of a sudden you're going to have 2,000 known terrorists running around as you do in the UK. 2,000 known terrorists, 200 known terror cells, homegrown cells. I mean, imagine if we had those sorts of numbers in the States, we'd be going nuts every day. Not to say that it'd get that far, but just so you understand that you still have to address it. It's still something you have to make sure that these people feel welcome, and so we don't find ourselves in the same situation. So, long answers to short questions. Keith,
hey,
nice to see you, by the way.
And I don't know if you addressed this in the book, but in this growing hatred, if you will, do they make a distinction between the American government, the American people, and the American military?
Less so than before. Usually, in fact, that's the preface of every conversation you'll have at a cafe in Cairo or Damascus. It's not about you, it's about your government. You're welcome in my country, let me pour you a cup of tea. And you do still get that sort of treatment. I very rarely get shouted at. I get certainly debated at, but no one pushes me away. They want to talk, but they want your ear. But when you look at the polling, that distinction is fading. More will hold us responsible. I mean, it's a difficult thing to measure scientifically, but at least in terms of polling numbers, people begin to blame us as well, in effect. I mean, it's partly because, that happened especially after 2004. You would even hear that in Europe as well. So that's another thing that we can't count on necessarily. Please.
Do people in Jordan or Afghanistan somehow distinguish between Europe or America? Do they recognize that Europe does not participate?
It's not a hard distinction because many tend to see the West as a monolithic alliance to some degree. It's always U.S. led, but that we're part of the same ilk and part of the same conspiracy, in effect. And that's certainly what you'll hear from guys in Britain, for instance, blowing up the subways there. They talk about the West. You're sort of two heads of a two-headed snake kind of thing. U.S. most guilty party, but not the only guilty party. Yeah. Please.
You have a message that is obviously of great importance politically in this country in terms of understanding the context of U.S. policy in the Middle East, and one that I know of nobody else who's really talking about. perhaps you know of others who are saying something similar, but I don't know of anything like that. But I'm struck by what seems to be a bit of a disconnect between your experiences and your overall message and what you're saying about what we need to do. I mean, you've said, well, we should keep our promises and things, keep an engagement with people like the folks that you interviewed. But you haven't addressed the most fundamental question, as I understand it, which is the occupation of Muslim lands.
Sure.
I want to push you a little bit
Yeah.
to address that. I mean, isn't that really the bottom line, most important question that we have to deal with in this country? And if not, why not?
Absolutely. And I neglected to mention, I mean, the biggest point really is that they don't want to constantly deal with America only at the point of a gun. That is the, to the extent that is the extent of American policy in that part of the world, to address Islamic extremism, blunt force, hammer, bombs, that's not going to work. And that's really, I should have been more explicit, but and that's the key point. Now the question is, how do you undo what they see as our biggest mistake, Iraq and Afghanistan? First distinction is that most Afghans still want us to stay. They feel, first of all, as I said before, they still kind of like us, majority still like us there, but they also feel that they still need our help. Fewer in Iraq now. I think that about 2 years ago is when it dipped below 50%, the number of Iraqis, maybe 3 years ago now, who support the U.S. occupation. But even Iraqis who say that will say, but you can't leave today. Well, some will say, please leave today, but another equally sizable group say, listen, you've screwed things up so badly, if you leave today, you'll screw it up even more. So they're not so sure that they want an immediate withdrawal, and it's a reasonable point of view. But I think it's important to mention that, because any sense that you have that whenever we do leave there, or however we do, or however gradually, that you're going to have a wellspring of gratitude for having brought them this grand Middle Eastern democracy, or anything close to what we promised, we're not going to have that when you leave. And I think there are real, even beyond what the sentiment is, I think there are bigger geopolitical questions about whether we will have created a reliable ally there. Is it actually going to be closer to Tehran than to Washington? The current and future Iraqi government, I think that's a possibility. So, yeah, absolutely.
But just to follow up for a minute, you talk about the geopolitical question. Isn't the real geopolitical issue that we ought to be focusing on the impact of U.S. occupation, military occupation in Afghanistan, Iraq, and now I'm afraid we're talking about Pakistan as well, because the United States now appears to be committed to commando raids into Pakistan, despite the fact the Pakistani government is absolutely opposed to it. The geopolitical issue of the impact of that on Muslim sentiment in the Middle East and around the world, isn't that a bigger issue? Shouldn't we regard that as a really urgent issue to be addressed above and beyond, how many people in Iraq would like us to stay a bit longer to help out one side or the other?
Well, absolutely, because that's a driving force of that sentiment. The reason I focus on the sentiment, because in my view that reflects that the core ideology of the guys who were driven to fly those planes into the towers and the Pentagon 7 years ago, that core ideology has more of a following today than it did 7 years ago, and that's a problem. And that should scare the heck out of us to some degree. And that many things we've done since 9/11 in that respect have made us less safe than we were then. I should qualify that point by saying that bin Laden's popularity has plummeted during that time. People, one of the reasons is the number of Muslims who have been killed by his attacks and attacks inspired by him. So when I say core ideology, I'm not saying that that all these people are signing up for Al Qaeda, but more the background sentiment, the sense that it's us against you, that you have it in for us, that you have double standards, hypocritical, all that kind of stuff. So, yeah. Please.
I'm interested in where or whether they make a distinction between our being in Afghanistan and in Iraq, whether it's lumped up together, the U.S. is invading or occupying Muslim land, or whether there is some distinction that one may have had some justification and the other none, or
There is.
where that might be, or whether it's faded over time.
There is a distinction, and it's interesting, and I like to make that. I make that point, particularly in the Saudi chapter. That there's an Al Qaeda guy who was with Bin Laden at Tora Bora, who I profile there, and he has this sense of good jihad and bad jihad. It's funny, just to get at this idea that if we think that they're just crazed, while they have their own moral compass, whether we agree with it or not, but it just shows the complexity of the thinking. And he and others that you'll talk to, not everyone, but others will say, well, we kind of understand why you went to war in Afghanistan. They attacked you. I might do the same thing. I don't like it. I don't like having Americans on Muslim soil, but at least, usually, and this is the way the argument will usually come up, at least it's better than Iraq. You only went in there for oil and to give us another kick in the head, that kind of thing. So there is a distinction. Now, that distinction doesn't necessarily help you as much as you would like, because once they make that point, they'll say, but still, you shouldn't be there either. It's not always going to be intellectually consistent point of view, but you do at least hear the distinction. Yeah. No.
You spoke about the jihadi talking points being now echoed by the public, and you found that to be the most alarming thing. Could it be that this has always existed to some extent, but we never actually paid attention to the public until after 9/11, until after the rise of jihadis? Because if you look at the list of grievances you mentioned, take away Iraq, they've all existed before. Double standard in terms of the perception of Israel, support of unpopular regimes, not having their interests at heart, and so these jihadis are the reason they're extremists is because they represent somewhat of a common view, except that they take to the extreme and actually act out on.
I guess it's a matter of degree. It's interesting. There was a Lebanese member of parliament who I interviewed, and I mentioned him just very briefly in the book, but this is the time in Beirut when the entire parliament of the March 14th camp, they were locked in a hotel room because they were getting knocked off one by car bombs, and so they had to stay behind guards and concrete barriers because it was the most cynical political maneuvering you can imagine. They were whittling down their majority by killing them, and they were sort of getting down. They had a majority of 7, and they had 5 and 6 and 3 and 2. So I talked to him, and he's part of the reformist movement there. So the reformist movement supported by the states. You'd expect him to say, absolutely, we're glad to have your help. You've been good. You helped push the Syrians out, that sort of thing. But he, like you, said, listen, I asked him, when's the last time you felt good about America in this region? And I was thinking maybe he would have said around 9/11, we understood, we have a common cause, that kind of thing, or something like that, something recent. And he said, yeah, no, I know that the last time I felt good about America was 1952. And I was, why 1952? Because the Suez Crisis, when the U.S. told Britain and France basically they couldn't steal the Suez Canal. So he had to look back 56 years, if I have that year right, for the last time he thought America had done some good in that part of the world. So it's not new. And it's also not entirely of our making, as you know. Some of this is policy. Saudi Arabia spends a lot of money spreading Wahhabi thought. I mean, Wahhabi thought is not by itself violent, but it certainly helps feed this in a lot of different countries. Saudi Arabia, another ally. And countries like Egypt, they use this anti-American feeling to their advantage. Gamila Ismail is constantly photographed when she meets with American officials or American reporters. When I was interviewing her, there was a guy who popped up in the lobby behind us and he was videoing us. And they used that picture to say, here is Gamila Ismail commiserating with her American friends again. She is not a friend of Egypt, that kind of thing. So this is the Egyptian government uses that to take down their political opponents at home, that we supposedly support. And it was interesting, just another related story. Ayman Noor sent a letter to Barack Obama about a month ago, appealing to him for help, just to get his case on his radar screen. Ayman Noor is already in prison he's been there for 3 years of a 5-year term. He's now being taken to court by the Egyptians for the offense of commiserating with a foreign leader. So he's got another, his rap sheet's growing longer just for sending a letter to Barack Obama. So it's, I don't mean to say that it started on September 12th, 2001, and we certainly can't be held responsible for it because a lot of this is a product of failed systems. You got a lot of unemployed, uneducated, hopeless guys out there. There's a great statistic that in the next 20 years, the Persian Gulf has to create, Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, have to create 85 million jobs just to occupy this big generational balloon you have about to come into the 18 to 22-year-old age group. That's a big problem because if those guys don't have a future, it makes it a lot easier for them to volunteer for, and that's not our fault, it's because their governments take all their money and use it for vacations in Saint-Tropez, you know, that kind of thing. So, long answer to a short question again. I saw you.
You paint a pretty bleak picture of Arab and Muslim public opinion, but it does seem at the political level that a lot of the regimes in those places support the U.S. I mean, you have to sort of believe that the Pakistanis don't seem to mind that much that we're bombing the Taliban in Wazir province, and Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and so on. So are we better off dealing with the dictators?
Well, it's interesting, Pakistan. I agree with you that I think they're probably relieved that we're dropping some bombs there now because every time they made an attempt in the tribal areas, they got their butts kicked. But it is also certainly true that elements of the Pakistani government are involved with the Taliban and connected. The ISI, Pakistani intelligence, developed them in the past, created them in the past as a lever of power in Afghanistan and maintains those connections. And in their view, it serves their interests to mess up Afghanistan a little bit. They don't want to be a total mess, but they want it to be enough of a mess that it's not threatening their strength, their power, their influence in the region. So, I mean, they, like a lot of folks, and that, like every country in the world, plays it both sides. So, I mean, is your question, is it better? Well, why is it better to? Yeah.
What do we have to look forward to if democracy prevails?
Well, you saw with Hamas's election in Palestine that you don't always get the result you want, right? And I mean, if we had our choice, we probably wouldn't want the Shiite alliance to have won in Iraq either. There's certainly much more secular parties there. So I mean, that's the danger. That's the danger of, and we had that proven in Iraq and proven certainly in the Palestinian territories that democracy by itself is certainly not a panacea for what we're facing. I hope that's something of an answer to your question. Yeah, please.
You've got a wealth of perspective, and I wondered, first of all, how it feels to be back to the United States and trying to explain to people what you know. And then also, I've spent 9 years in Egypt between 1981 and 2004, and I've seen the whole thing change from being a liberal country to very, very conservative. But to what extent do you think the government there is sort of fighting for its life to stay secular, and if they do allow some of the democracy that the sort of urban elite, liberal elite in Cairo want, the whole country is going to sort of cascade and fall into a more
Absolutely. If you had elections today, the Muslim Brotherhood would win like that. There's no question, and they know that, and that's why they beat up Muslim Brotherhood candidates when they have parliamentary elections, and lock them, take their names off the ballot. That's the thing. I mean, it certainly challenges your commitment to principle when you know that you may not like the results. The trouble is that in the current environment, you haven't made America safer by this current policy. And I'm speaking purely from U.S. interests here as opposed to Egyptian interests. This isn't working. It's not going to be simple, and you're not always going to be able to play it straight. That's just not the way geopolitics works. But the point I try to make here is that this isn't working. When I go there, and when you ask the way I feel when I come home, I feel like I want to raise the alarm, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I think that we tend to think of it as a very simplistic point of view, and therefore easier to address, or at least easier to categorize. Because it's more complex and more widespread, it makes it more of a challenge to address it. And that's one thing I wanted to do with this, was break those caricatures, get at the complexity, and hopefully in a small way that can move the debate forward.
What is your impression of what would happen if the Muslim Brotherhood were to gain power?
Well, they're interesting. They've grown more moderate in the last 5-10 years. I mean, their history is certainly not moderate, but they're not. And then there's the question: do they fall into the moderate category? I mean, they're more moderate than they used to be, but I'm not sure we would consider them moderate. They no longer espouse violence. Even some of the guys, I can't remember his name right now, but the guy who wrote effectively the sort of jihadi manifesto, who's in prison in Egypt, recanted about a year ago. There was some coverage of that here. He said to his followers, "You know what? Actually, we got it wrong. That's not the way. That's not the way forward." There was a lot of questions about whether he was forced to do it or did he sell out. I mean, he got a lot of criticism in the Islamic blogosphere. But you know, the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood are no longer what they used to be, but they're still more conservative than we would want. But is it better to keep them from running and to beat them up every time there's an election? And it hasn't created a stable political system in Egypt. When I visit there and I talk to U.S. diplomats, who certainly off the record, and some other analysts, they say this place could go in a second. It looks much more stable than you think. There's Fawaz Gerges, who's a great Middle Eastern analyst, Sarah Lawrence, and he's just written 2 books in the last year. He compared it to the situation in Iran before the fall of the Shah. Now that's a bold prediction to make. Mubarak could last another 25 years and his son could follow him, but he sees the situation there as much more precarious than outsiders would see it. I'm not sure I agree with him, but he's a smart guy.
So of the sort of everyday people you're talking to, how there are people talking about the American presidential election?
Absolutely, yeah. It's amazing how much coverage it gets, and Obama, gets a lot of attention. You see his picture. I mean, it's not to say that he's the solution to all the problems, but there is, his story is exciting to people in that part of the world, and I think it feeds into the sense that America actually, that some of the propaganda about America is true. That a guy who's the son of a Kenyan and had a single mother who was on food stamps can make it nearly to the highest levels of power show that there's still something good in America. That America, the dream, still exists. And that, I think, is one reason why the sense of disappointment is so strong, which feeds more the resentment. You could be so much better, and here's what you are to us, and that's a disappointment. It sounds pie in the sky, but you know what? I hear it from so many different people, and people that you would think would be total, complete lost cases, that you'd have no hope. They say, actually, the other thing that'll happen a lot of times when you're in this part of the world, you'll talk to the guy, not necessarily the guy in a prison, but a guy in a madrasa or something like that, and I'll say, "Oh, my cousin, he lives in New Jersey. You're from New York." Everybody's got a relative in New Jersey. I don't understand it. Please.
The themes you mentioned, some appear more intense to arouse greater anger than others. For example, sense of occupation is a sense of stealing, is a sense of killing us. Some of the other themes you mentioned were like disappointment. Could you explain further whether all these themes are sort of distributed in different ways? Or the occupation motivates the jihadists, but occupation doesn't motivate some of the other folks you talk about?
I think that, occupation is a motivator for everybody. I think that's, as you mentioned earlier, I mean, that's the key. At the end of the day, the wars are the ones, listen, you feel the most because they're the most tangible examples. And you see the effects every day. They still see the effects every day. But still, I'm still surprised by how the touchy-feely, warm and fuzzy stuff is almost as extensive, almost as widespread. And you'd think it'd be less important, but my feeling is that it's still important, because again it goes back to they have a sense of what we should be and we're not. But then that provides, at least to me, some hope, because there is a sense of what we should be that they like, and provides an opening. You're not going to win everybody over. I mean, the guy sitting in that cell, you're never going to win him over, I think. But you have to go for the middle group, if we would. That answer your question?
I'm just wondering what some of the people feel. What is the sense of occupation of someone who feels that we should do more to rescue the Iranian former campaign president in jail? They feel a sense of occupation there at the same time.
You mean it's contradictory, right? To say, go away, but we want your help. Yeah. Well, Afghanistan's a perfect example, because people do feel the sense of occupation, but they need the help now. And what it shows you is you have a limited time frame to make it work in effect. And if you run out of that time frame and you're not meeting expectations and things, people start to say, well, at least the trains ran on time under the Taliban, right? But so it shows that you better act when you have the chance. And for instance, in Iraq, I think you have the same dynamic in Iraq. The character there is a surgeon at Yarmouk Hospital. This is the biggest trauma hospital in Baghdad. And when he's a Shiite, very educated, secular family. If there was anybody who threw roses when U.S. troops invaded, he was the guy. He bought it. He thought Bush was a hero. He said Bush was on the level with the prophets when the invasion happened. So over the course of the next 5 years, he's sitting in Yarmouk Hospital. Every car that goes off in Baghdad, the bodies go to Yarmouk, whether they're dead or alive. And he's probably treated 10,000 of them during that time, or seen at least, sent one to the morgue and tried to piece the others together. And over that time, we lost him, in effect. And he today, first of all, it's not the country, he says, this is not the country you promised me. Certainly it's not the price you asked us to pay, 100,000 dead Iraqis, whichever estimate you go for, 160,000, the WHO estimate. Certainly not the price, and he says, we're paying the price. You think you've paid the price with U.S. soldiers? We've paid it times 50. And then the thinking beyond the disappointment and the sense that it would have been better off before, then it goes into the conspiracy theory, which you hear more and more in Iraq, and you're starting to hear in Afghanistan, that this is what the U.S. intended all along, to justify a lengthy occupation. There were stories going around that the U.S. military blew up a lot of car bombs in Baghdad, that we were doing that again to make it necessary for troops to stay. Once you've gotten that far, you know you're in trouble. So I hope that gets at what you were talking about.
We're getting close to our end time here. If we have maybe two, sir, and then we'll take two final questions here, and then we'll.
On that note, because there is so much focus in this country on what people are calling the coming victory in Iraq. Sarah Palin was ridiculing Obama for failing to acknowledge the coming victory in Iraq. And so on that note, how do you think they consider our rhetoric? Do they think we're talking about future dominance of the Middle East or mere stability when we say that?
Well, I think you hear a lot of, you don't know what we've been through. If you're talking that way now, you clearly don't know what we've been through these last few years. It's not victory in our terms. You'll hear that from some. But I don't mean to underestimate the change that's happened there and the relief. My Iraqi doctor friend, Dr. Jamal, the number of bodies that come into his ER today compared to 2 years ago, I mean, it's the difference between 50 a day and 2. And that's a major change, and he's relieved. And he says, thank you. He, like a lot of Iraqis, gives more credit to Iraqis for the drop in violence, the awakening councils, the ceasefire with Sadr's militia. But he's certainly relieved, and he looks at the U.S. less hatefully today because of that. But you haven't won him over, and partly it's just because it's taken a long time and the price was high. Yeah.
And one final question here. Yeah.
I was wondering if you have a sense of what might be some of the levers that the U.S. really has to address some of these issues, and especially some of the themes. How might you think about changing the narratives, if you will? What levers do we really, what can we really?
Levers to change the sentiment or to change sentiment. I think it's, some of the touchy-feely stuff makes a difference. Well, it's more than touchy-feely. I mean, some of the non-military stuff does make a difference. Closing Guantanamo would make a difference. People knows that. A lot of them will say, too little, too late, but it will make a difference. In a place like Egypt, smaller scale examples, if the U.S. uses its influence to do something that's perceived by political reformers there, for instance, releasing a guy like Ayman Noor, that kind of thing does make a difference because people listen. The way Abu Ghraib still is repeated is because that was seen as such a violation of U.S. morals. Now, our successes wouldn't ring as long and loud as our failures invariably, but you have to avoid the big mistakes and try to make as many real positive differences as possible. And you have to deal with the occupation. I mean, and again, it's not an easy solution because there is a lot of you broke it kind of mentality, so don't leave until you fixed it.
I know Jim has a radio interview, and he's at Politics and Prose tonight, as well as the Good Morning America, O'Reilly Factor, and Charlie Rose over the next 48 hours. But we are very grateful that his first appearance was here at New America. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for